You can now stream the forbidden documentary Occult Louisiana free on Tubi TV. Hello friends, we are in a troubling time when it comes to misinformation. The views of our guests do not reflect that of my own. This show is for entertainment purposes only, and any information presented during this show is a live-action role-play scenario. All that being said, enjoy this episode. Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Today my guest is Mario Garza. First, check out Magic Mind. If you've been listening to this show, you know that from the start, my affiliates have only been products that I personally use and find beneficial. I only endorse reputable, honest, and consciously aware businesses and products, mainly health and wellness, mental health, and self-reliance. Magic Mind has been my answer to lack of energy, stress, and sluggish mental performance. After just a few days of using Magic Mind, I've noticed that I can work for much longer periods of time and stay focused without taking a break. I've also noticed that my stress levels have been much lower, and by the end of the day, I am ready for a good night's sleep. To learn more about the incredible benefits of Magic Mind, visit their website, use the link in the description, and right now you can get up to 48% off your first subscription or 20% off one-time purchases if you use code FORBIDDEN20. That's magicmind.com/forbidden20 or use the link right in the description. Also, be sure to check out the Forbidden documentary, Occult Louisiana. We are on the final stretches of producing our second film, Doors of Perception. By watching the Forbidden documentary, Occult Louisiana, it helps us with production of our second film. Also, you can get a Rokfin premium membership, rokfin.com/FKN+. Always be sure to download our podcast episodes directly through Spreaker. And we are booking guests for January. If you have suggestions or you'd like to be a guest, email me forbiddenknowledgenews@gmail.com. Today I want to welcome Mario Garza. He is the curator of symbolic studies online. He has been an art director and graphic designer for over 25 years, as well as researching symbolism, astrology, and tarot. Mario, welcome. How you doing?
I'm good, man. Thanks for the invite.
Thanks so much for coming on. I'm really looking forward to discussing your research into the power, mechanics, and meaning of symbols. This is a very deep and multi-layered topic to discuss, and you've been taking deep dives into symbolic studies for a very long time, as well as working with symbols through your art and graphic design work. So very much looking forward to learning more about this and your research, but this is your first time on. Before we get too far into this, tell us a little bit more about yourself and what got you involved in symbolic studies.
Yeah, for sure. So I consider myself a lifelong artist. I've always been very visual. So when I was really young, I would always draw, and I was always just kind of perceiving things around me, right? I feel like my eyes and my vision have kind of been maybe a little more important to me than some other people, I think. And so I was always just absorbing, just media and consuming sort of the things around me. And eventually I got into graphic design when I was a teenager. So I've been designing for 25 years, which is pretty crazy for me to say. But that really opened up so many things to me. I started taking my art history a little more seriously. I started getting into, artists that really spoke to me and things like that. And over time, I got interested in film and filmmaking. I went to film school for a little while. But somewhere around 2008, 2009, I started buying symbolic dictionaries. And I never realized that this was even like a pursuit that you can kind of take on. And I thought it was fascinating that you can look into the symbolic meaning of like an animal or a color, right? Or a number or a shape. And that really spoke to me because of my sort of artistic nature, right? And ever since then, I just started acquiring more and more symbolic reference books, symbolic authors. I started getting to know just kind of like who was out there and what kind of stuff they put out. I started really getting the lay of the land when it came to that world. And so I kind of acquired this library. And at some point, I would find the tarot, and the tarot really opened me up to all sorts of things, aspects of occultism and esoterica, things related to astrology and the planets and whatnot. So that kind of opened me wide and kind of broadly to all of these new sort of things. And once I started reading about the tarot itself and the elemental correspondences and whatever, I already naively thought I understood symbolism until I started reading that material. And then I realized how much there is actually to learn about it. And so I just started taking it more and more seriously. And I realized that it was actually helping me with design too, with clients and everything else, and like producing like logos and artwork and whatever. And so it was kind of a perfect match that way. And over time, I felt like I was learning so much about symbolism, and in particular, a lot about the tarot and astrology, that I wanted to start sharing, basically what I was learning. And so I created Symbolic Studies in 2020. And actually, ever since then, I've grown a lot as a symbologist. And, once you put something out there online, people are going to give you feedback. People are going to give you book recommendations. People are going to tell you that you're wrong. It's this or that or whatever. So it's really allowed me to kind of come into my own, as a symbologist, I guess you can say. And I'm really fortunate to have a lot of like amazing followers too. Like I put stuff out and people send me so much information. And so anything I put out now, I feel like I always level up right after I post it. But that's kind of Symbolic Studies in my history in a little nutshell.
Right on. Great introduction. Let's go back as far as we can when trying to understand symbolism. It's obviously been the earliest form of communication, but I think you and I share a similar perspective as it relates to the origin of symbols possibly coming from a different realm, an imaginal plane, something beyond our visual perception, that maybe these eternal archetypes that present themselves throughout human history.
Right, right. Yeah, oh yeah. No, exactly. I mean, basically, symbolism is a bridge to that other side, right? And so it's the means best used to describe metaphysical truths. And so that's what I've learned over time, is that that's really what you're getting into. And the way I've learned it too is that this imaginal realm, as you refer to it, that's of a higher order. And what we're living in, to me, appears to be of a lower order. And so things in this realm, in this lower order or this material realm, they're actually echoes or a reflection of something higher, right? Of this higher domain or law or whatever you want to say. And so the way I put it is that essentially the realm of symbolism, the realm of thought, the dream world, if you will, the realm of meaning, the spirit realm preceded the physical realm, right? And so that's how it works. So anything physical here, I'm looking at a cup right now, right? The meaning behind a cup, or the meaning behind the vessel, and the symbolic value of the vessel came before the actual vessel itself, right? Mm-hmm. And so I see that as kind of across the board just how it works from my perspective.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about how the ancients possibly accessed this etheric information and these symbols. Of course, we can look to the stars, and Astrology, a great example of symbolism throughout our history. But you mentioned dreams, and I'm sure altered states of many different kinds were involved in connecting to what's out there as far as symbolism, right?
Oh yeah, for sure, absolutely. And so essentially, what we pick up with our senses, anything and everything is symbolic, right? Whether we're doing that physically or that's happening on an astral level, right? And so everything is interpreted as symbolic because symbolic is, or anything that is symbolic rather, is just a metaphor for something else. It's meant to represent something else, right? And so whether we're talking about, just anything, anything having to do with light or touch or sound, language, right? The alphabet itself, anything and everything, it's all symbolic here. It's how we perceive it all, essentially. So there are different ways of basically communicating and receiving these symbols and receiving these insights and everything else. So that's as varied as kind of it gets, really, because everything really truly is a representation of something else. And so the symbolic world that's what that is. So then the question becomes, it's like, well, then what is the meaning behind whatever it is you're talking about?
Symbolism and magic seem to be intertwined and connected in very profound ways. Whenever you look into the way symbols were used for magical practices and ritual purposes throughout our ancient past, it's very interesting to see how it has an effect on the collective conscious. But how do these magical connections really originate when it comes to symbolism?
Right. Well, to me, it's like we're all magicians, you know, and so that's how I tend to perceive things, is that we're all magicians in our own right. We're all little wizards or witches or whatever you want to say. And so how it came to be, how did these correspondences develop? My personal opinion, actually, and these are really great questions. And I'm starting to learn how to communicate and speak about the nature of symbolism, like as a whole. A lot of people ask me to come on their show and we talk about very specific symbols. So we'll be talking about a specific animal or a constellation or a sign or something along these lines. But the actual conversation about like what this whole entire study is, I would say for whatever reason, people are more interested in discussing that these days, with me at least. But my opinion is that there was a tradition that preceded all other traditions. And some people have referred to this as the primordial tradition. And the idea behind this tradition, and there's a number of authors that have talked about it like this, is that this early tradition basically is where all other traditions came from. And this early tradition, that there was an actual, real sort of metaphysical doctrine, an actual understanding of how things worked on a metaphysical level. And there was an understanding of what symbols were supposed to be used for, or maybe how they're best used for our spiritual development and everything else. And so the understanding of symbolism goes back to these earlier peoples and this ancient primordial tradition. I would say, too, that this tradition is in line with what some other people have referred to as a northern tradition or a polar tradition. And this has Hyperborean sort of subtexts and kind of leanings, because the idea is that essentially everything seemingly emanates from a center and then returns back to that same center. So it's not unlike a torus field, basically. And so I've really gotten into the symbolic nature and the value of the center, and this idea that everything is expressed from one unified place, but then also returns back to it. That all journeys are basically moving away from the center and then moving back towards it. And some people have likened this to basically the North, right? And so it depends on what your cosmology is. But if you look in the heavens, the North Star is the central star, in the sky. All of the other stars around it, all of the fixed stars revolve around it counterclockwise, right? And so there's a relationship between this North Star or pole star and also the northern portion of Earth, which some people have basically said is, the origin of humanity. A lot of people have kind of made that claim, or that this is where the Garden of Eden was, or this is where paradise was, the original paradise, something along these lines. And that humanity maybe originated in the north, migrated away from it. And there's a lot of myths that actually completely encode this idea, I would say. But the understanding of symbolism to me was intact and understood way back when. And now I think what humanity is doing is a lot of that symbolic information is either underground, it's occulted, and there's people who do have an understanding of it, and they have an understanding that there is like a lot of value to gain from understanding what these different symbols mean. But there's also a lot of distortion as well. So modern man tends to distort a lot of information, especially old, archaic, ancient information and whatnot. And so I would say that, magicians and whatnot, using these symbols, this goes way, way back. Like when humanity was basically living in its golden age, that's what I would say too, that this primordial tradition was during the last golden age. People had an understanding that symbols are meaningful. Everything literally has meaning. My understanding as well is during this primordial tradition and during, I guess, kind of like even societies that have a tradition, something that they're trying to preserve and keep intact, everything had meaning. Every single aspect of life had meaning. So there wasn't a part of your day, there wasn't anything that you did throughout the day that did not have symbolic value. Your clothes had meaning, right? How you designed your home, where you decided to sleep, what you ate, what you discussed, the stories you told your children, everything had meaning to it. And so I think what the magicians of today understand, they understand that aspect, is that everything has meaning behind it. And so understanding what that meaning is will kind of give you a leg up in manifestation, or if you're doing rituals or spell work or whatever, right? And so I know I kind of went all over the place there, but that's kind of
No, that's
where
great.
I'm at with it.
I love it. I love it. Let's get deeper into center symbolism, the northern symbolism, the pole star references, as well as how this could have shifted to something more of a cosmic focus symbolism after a certain period.
Yeah, I mean, so that has been my rabbit hole. I consider it to be like my the rabbit hole of rabbit holes for me personally, because it took me so far and I'm still crawling down it and I'm still exploring that information because I get so much out of it. Starting around 2013, 2014, I got interested in the northern portion of the sky, right? A lot of people, when they get into astrology, obviously you're just paying attention to the path of the sun and the constellations around the path of the sun, right? And I pay attention to that too, and I've produced a lot of videos and presentations and stuff like that at this point about all of these constellations and what they mean and everything else. But there was something pulling me towards the North Star, and I just thought it was interesting that this star is unique among all of the other stars in the heavens, right? And then obviously there's different expressions like following your true north, the North Star is known as the guiding star and things like that. And I got interested in it and I found out that this primordial tradition also kind of prioritized that portion of the sky. And so the North Star definitely would be sort of the preeminent star up there, but then also its surrounding stars. So Ursa Major and Ursa Minor. So that's the Big Dipper and the Little Dipper, the Great Bear and the Little Bear. And the tip of the handle of the Little Dipper is the pole star itself, right? And they each have 7 stars. And so I thought this was really interesting. And I found out that there's actually a lot of occult information about these two constellations. And so guys like Peter Levenda, I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work, but he's written about it in multiple books. And so he has a book called Stairway to Heaven, and he talks about basically these constellations up there and how important they were to alchemists and magicians and people who were astral traveling and things like that. And essentially, he says that, these were sort of the preeminent stars of enlightenment, if you will, right? Way back when. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. I'm like, this guy's talking about it. Who else is talking about it? And so I came across guys like Kenneth Grant, who's like a post-Crowleyan sort of guy. And he wrote about this as well. And he actually compares, and I think he's not alone on this one, but he basically attributes Doth to corresponding with the North. So this would be the hidden Sephiroth in the Tree of Life, right? So if you're going to access the root side of the tree, the night side of the Tree of Life, the inverse, the Klipothic tree, that you go through Doth, which is, again, related to the North. And so I'm like, that's really interesting too. And so I came across all of this work about the North Star being a gateway to heaven, basically. The North Star being along the lines of what's referred to as the world axis. And this is the idea that there is a central axis or a central pole that everything revolves around, basically. And so pivot symbolism, circumambulation symbolism, axial symbolism is completely tied up in all of this stuff. And then from there, I started finding the authors that were talking about it like 100, 150 years ago. A lot of the same material. And then I started coming across the deities that were associated with it in the Vedic world, and how there's Japanese deities that correspond with the pole star and all these things. And, basically I realized that this is actually like a real sort of thing. And what has happened is essentially that the earliest sky clock, from what I gather, is actually Ursa Major and Minor going around the pole star counterclockwise. And a number of different cultures had a lot of different associations. It's one of the most potent parts of the night sky you can possibly come across, right? So Ursa Major has been compared to a thigh of a bull. So in ancient Egypt, it was known as the thigh of a bull. And they actually have different reliefs and illustrations where they present a bull's thigh to like a pharaoh, right? And so it plays a part in what's referred to as the opening of the mouth ritual, which is basically the opening of this gateway. And other cultures refer to Ursa Major as a plow, as a chariot. It's been viewed as sailors. It's been viewed as reindeer, all of these different things. And I'm like, how is it that there's so much information about these constellations? And yet a lot of what I was reading beforehand, people didn't really discuss this. It wasn't sort of like a thing. But what I learned is what happened was there was a great shift from a polar understanding, a polar symbolic framework, to a solar framework, which is the world in which we live today, basically. So there was a major shift from polar symbolism to solar symbolism. And what I've read and heard is that even like in ancient China, their zodiac essentially was right around the North Star. And they had 8 constellations during this polar primordial age. And then when the world became more solar, they actually shifted those 8 constellations to the path of the sun, and then added 4 more constellations, giving them 12 zodiac signs, basically. And so this seems to have been a worldwide sort of trend or trajectory to move from a northern polar understanding of things, looking at that as your sort of primary sky clock, to moving to the path of the sun. So hence the polar to solar shift. And it's fascinating because this is a whole paradigm shift too. This was a paradigm shift for me to actually understand this. But once you can wrap your head around it, and once you read about it, it makes all of the sense in the world for a lot of different reasons. And so now when I am decoding different constellations or symbols, I'm like blown away how much of it actually relates back to like a northern understanding of things.
Right on. Now, you had mentioned how the polar understandings and that era was more of an understanding that the Earth may be more of a central force in the galaxy, and we moved away from that as we had this solar understanding. How did it basically affect the collective consciousness after this shift?
That is one of the most important questions, honestly. The implications are absolutely massive. and kind of like I would say is all pervasive. It changed everything. And so the way I put it is the pole. Sometimes this old tradition, by the way, is referred to as the mystic pole tradition. And what you'll find is that there are still traditions today where they have a central pole or they have a central totem that they have a very strong connection with. And so, two quick examples would be like the maypole, right? So you have the maypole, and then you go around the maypole. This is the world axis. This is that central pole. Probably the best example we have in the modern world is the Kaaba cube in Mecca. And so the Kaaba cube represents this central pole in Islam, the spiritual pole of Islam. So what my understanding and how I perceive it is that during the polar tradition, people had way more of a local sort of reverence and a local priority with everything, basically. And so this would mean prioritizing yourself with your village, your people, your tradition, and also too, there's a relationship with this central northern polar dynamic with also having a relationship with your center, basically, that it encourages you to go within. And so even when you look at Ursa Major and Minor going around the pole star, what I've learned is that the counterclockwise rotation that you see of the fixed stars, that's actually more of a polar rotation. That's what some symbologists have referred to it as. It's a polar rotation, meaning that it actually brings you closer inward, right, to that central totem, to that central pole. The clockwise rotation, like on all of our clocks, right? That's more of a solar rotation. That's actually more expansive. So we're talking about expanse versus like a contraction, right? And so in Islam, when people go to the Kaaba cube and you go around it 7 times, this is a huge aspect of polar symbolism, the number 7. It's been said that if the solar world tree has 12 branches, the polar world tree has 7 branches, basically. When they go around this central totem 7 times, they go counterclockwise because they're actually being drawn closer in to that sacred center, to their sacred center, basically. And so everything had more of this inner dynamic. I think people had a stronger sort of sense of purpose and intention and meaning, kind of like what I was talking about earlier. But they also like stood their ground. To me, I like to say that people had something to fight for. People had something to believe in. People had something to protect, right? Today, in the solar world, people are, I would say, generally kind of lost. And I would say that we're a people without a pole, basically, that we just give away our power. And so it's not unlike the rays of the sun, where the rays of the sun expand from the center, right? And so I see it that in today's world, we just give our attention away to everything, but we're never drawn back towards the center, basically. And so this is why I'm so passionate about this topic, is because, you know, I'm of the opinion that if you know thyself, you'll know the universe. And I'm of the opinion that your center connects with all centers. And actually, the way I see it too is that there are realms above and below, but they are all connected through their center, basically. It's not unlike a chakra system or something along those lines, if you want to use that metaphor. So chakra literally means wheel. And so just like your chakras, right, which I believe is mostly metaphorical, but I feel like it's a helpful metaphor. There are 7 chakras along your spine. That spine is the central axle in your body. And so this means that all chakras are connected through their center. This goes back to this stairway to heaven, or this bridge to the heavens sort of business being at the northern sky. So people in the polar age were more centered, right? That's what I would say. And actually, one of my favorite authors, what he says is that the golden age was actually when people were centered because they had this identification with the center. And that what makes the current dark age is that the center has been lost, or the center now is obfuscated or hidden. And so to me, this makes all the sense in the world when you go back to this idea that everything is expressed from the center, returns to the center, everything pivots around it. So many symbols go back to this. You know, if you look into the world mountain, the world tree, things like that, they always bring up the center, that it represents a symbolic center. Every mountain is like Mount Meru, right? Or a polar mountain. Every tree is like a world tree. That trunk of the tree is symbolic of this central axle. The other thing I'll say too is the wheel is such a great metaphor for all of this stuff. The middle of the wheel is where the reconciliation of opposites occurs. It's where you'll find the most balanced aspect of the wheel is in the center of the wheel. Symbolically, if you're on the external part of the wheel, you are operating more so outside of self. You are looking for external validation. You might be going through the hamster wheel or going through the motions of life. The external part of the wheel has been related to division and multiplicity. It kind of relates in a way to like a pie chart. You look at a pie chart from the top down, you have all of these different wedges, right? But they're all unified in the center. And so when you get to your center, you become what's referred to as the unmoved mover, right? And so you get to the still point within self, you get to the still point within that wheel. And just by being present, you cause the wheel to turn, essentially, right? And so there's a number of deities that actually relate to this, that they become the invariable, or they're the unmoved mover at the invariable middle in the center of the wheel. And the center of the wheel has been viewed as immutable, unchanging, right? And that is exactly what the pole star has been referred to as well. And so there's a whole entire metaphysical, spiritual sort of framework with all of this stuff. But I think it always encourages you to go inward. And when people became more solar, they lost that, I think. And so people are just giving away their energy, giving away their power, all of these types of things. Also, too, what I think happened is we no longer have like a root system, pretty much, and we no longer know where we've come from or anything like that. And I think that's always part of the agenda, is to erase your history, right? So I like to say that it makes more sense to say that we actually live in a polar system, not in a solar system. I think the solar system dynamic, I understand why it's put out there and why people refer to it that way. And there is actually some truth to that, because the sun is a symbol of the pole as well, which is a whole kind of conversation in and of itself. But I think that we do live in a polar system, and everything is dependent on this center, this central axle that, everything revolves around.
Any thoughts on what might have triggered this shift? Could it have been cosmic in nature, some sort of mass cataclysm, or maybe something else? What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's on the table for sure. I think that's interesting. I've heard that claim before. That doesn't conflict with anything that I have an understanding of personally. I was talking about it with a really knowledgeable astrologer, this exact same conversation about what caused this shift. And there's something to be said about the moon, and that perhaps this great shift had an intermediary sort of phase that was lunar. So from polar to lunar to solar, right? And that to me makes a lot of sense. The moon is all about transitions and cycles and things like that. There's a lot of hermetic mercurial symbolism tied to the moon. And so I see that Hermes Mercury is always about sort of a middle path. In fact, I would say, I just did a presentation on this, but Mercury has a lot of solar symbolism, lunar symbolism, and polar symbolism baked into it, like through and through. You can kind of like unpack all three of those relationships. There's like a 3-in-1 sort of dynamic with Mercury, or a triune sort of aspect to Mercury, I would say. But I was talking to this guy about this, and he brought up the fact that there were times before people even discussed the fact that there was a moon up in the heavens, or that there was a moon up in the sky. And so I'm not sure if you've heard of this, but apparently there are myths where people say that there was a time before the moon, basically. And so he brought to the table potentially the introduction of the moon. Did the moon actually start this shift away from polar symbolism towards something else, maybe lunar and then solar? So, I can't really say. I don't really know, but a cataclysm to me makes sense. I wonder if it's literally just a shift in perception somehow. when people talk about a pole shift, right? Most of the time, people talk about like a physical pole shift with the Earth and everything else. But I actually wonder if this is what it's referring to. That the pole shift is actually a shift in perspective, a shift in focus, basically, which is going to change the consciousness and psychology of man. So I don't have a definitive answer there, but I think all of these things are worth considering for sure.
Well, we're talking about our cosmology. There has always been a lot of Saturnian symbolism, and I've heard you to discuss this as well, the possibility that Saturn may have been a lot closer or more visible in our ancient past and more central to the belief surrounding that time period, right?
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely. So I did a couple of presentations. I called it the Lost Lore of Saturn. I did part one and part two where I got into this. And what triggered that for me was reading from multiple sources that they attribute Saturn with being the ruling planet of the last golden age. And that just got me thinking about so many different things. And as I looked into it and as I started decoding it, I'm like, man, this makes a lot of sense, but I don't know if it's the same sort of archetypal Saturn that we currently think of, basically. So we generally think of Saturn as a old man with a white beard, and right, he's holding that scythe, and he oftentimes, right, is carrying or next to an hourglass, something along these lines. And I see it that there's a lot of evidence to suggest that this was actually a fall from grace for Saturn, and that Saturn was actually viewed as more feminine, potentially a young maiden or a Kronos, right? And so it may have actually been an older, wise woman. And there's a lot to be said about the polar tradition actually being a tradition that has a lot of feminine symbolism that's actually more central to the tradition itself, which is in contrast to the solar age, where the sun, right, Christ as an example, sun, S-U-N, right, S-O-N, is more of a central sort of focus. And so I'm open to the idea that Saturn was actually viewed as being more feminine a long time ago. And there's goddesses that completely relate to this idea as well. But it's interesting because Saturn has a lot of polar symbolism associated with it. In fact, you can view the solstices as a pole, as a symbolic pole, and some symbologists have, and they've said that the solstices are basically it's a pole. It's a pole between the winter solstice and the summer solstice, right? So a pole between Cancer and Capricorn, Cancer for the summer and then Capricorn for the winter. Capricorn is ruled by Saturn itself, right? And so it's so interesting that there is a lot of northern symbolism baked into the winter solstice, right? Essentially, Christmas is a winter solstice holiday. It's close enough, and it just, to me, it makes a lot of sense that it basically that's what it's symbolic of or emblematic of, pretty much. And where does Santa come from? He comes from the North Pole. When you put a star on top of a Christmas tree, I'm inclined to think what you're actually doing is you're putting the North Star on top of the world tree, basically. And so it's also been said that literally between the solstices and the equinoxes, this cross that's made throughout the year, that if this is a cross that has cardinal directions, that the north actually corresponds with the winter solstice, right? And so Saturn is also viewed as being more contractive. And so this is in contrast, a lot of people like to talk about with Jupiter. Jupiter is viewed as being more expansive. Saturn is being viewed as mostly, for the most part, being very contractive in nature and restrictive. This is bringing you back to the center, right? So if you just contract enough, you're going back to the middle of a thing. And so, yeah, there's a lot of different ways to sort of unpack that. Saturn being polar, Saturn being northern. And so, yeah, to me, it makes sense that it lines up with this early tradition for all the reasons that I kind of said. But then there's this idea that Saturn was once either the old sun, or even one way I tend to look at it now is that it may have been the original pole star. So there's a whole conversation to be had about whether the pole star um, changes or not. And so this is basically a conversation of the precession of the equinoxes. Some people say that precession causes the pole star to change. Some people say that precession occurs, but the pole star doesn't change. I'm kind of at the moment, to be honest with you, I'm a little more agnostic about the whole entire thing. I just know that it is the current pole star right now. But people have considered Saturn to be the original sun or the original pole star. If you look into the electric universe model, some of these guys talk about Saturn's reign like a long time ago, right? So there's this old alignment where Saturn played a pretty prominent role in this central alignment, which just kind of reminds me more of like polar symbolism and things like that. Um, Also, though, I will say, this thread is kind of new to me, and I want to do a presentation on it. The star card. The star card is ruled by Aquarius, and in my opinion, when you look at the different cards that have like a clear rulership, you are looking at an expression of that sign. So when you're looking at the star card, you're looking at an expression of Aquarius itself, basically. And in that card, that is the pole star. There is a central star surrounded by seven other stars, right? Everything about it is polar in nature. And Aquarius used to be ruled by Saturn. That used to be the old correspondence, basically. So if we are moving into the age of Aquarius, right? Some people think it's already happened. Some people think we're going through it. Some people think it's happening down the road. I can't really say. That's not really my expertise personally. But if we're shifting towards the age of Aquarius, I wonder if we're actually swinging back to a polar age with some of this Saturnian influence. So that's just something I've been chewing on lately.
How do you think Saturn got such a negative perception, especially in recent times? Certain people that study different occult concepts will come to a conclusion that Saturn's connected with Satanism or some of these negative magical practices. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think in many ways, astrology and our understanding of the planets has been completely weaponized. And I would say that a lot of these things, these constellations or these planets, in their own way, they're kind of like tools, and so they're neutral. And so you can use a knife to do a number of different things, right? And so you can protect your family, you can murder somebody, etc. And so I definitely see where people are coming from with Saturn, right? All of the symbols are there to kind of associate it with this dark, lumbering, heavy force, right? It's associated with the devil card. Capricorn rules the devil card. But what I would say personally, where I'm at, is I'm not interested in pointing at anything outside of myself as a scapegoat or a savior, right? All of the scapegoats are within. All of the messiahs or saviors are within. The devil is within, right? And so that's how I look at it. So all of the gods and demons and angels and whatnot, it's like that's all part of who I am personally. So I take personal responsibility that way. But certainly, I mean, there are examples of groups being heavily Saturnian, doing some pretty gnarly stuff, right? And so there's a book called Fire and Ice by Stephen Flowers, and he really gets into a Saturnian cult in Germany and, the ways in which they do things and sort of their practices and rituals and all that kind of stuff. Saturn is a very heavy planet. There's just like no other way around it. But I would rather make friends with Saturn and understand my own Saturnian sort of complex and things like that. Otherwise, you're going to succumb to its sort of ways, or you're going to be sort of overcome by it. That it's better to sort of work with your shadow and work with your inner beast instead of trying to suppress it or denounce it. And so to me, Saturn is a friend. Saturn has been one of my greatest teachers, that I've come across personally, and so that's what I view. That's how I view symbolism, basically, is like all of the archetypes of the tarot, they're all within. The ones that are etheric and light and abundant, but also the ones that are sort of, darker and more sinister and whatnot. If you ignore that side of yourself, then that part of you will actually come out to play more. You know, if you don't understand it, it's actually you're going to do yourself a disservice.
You said something that's going to bring us down a bit of a rabbit hole. You were talking about the universe within, how all these angels and demons are actually a part of us, and I agree with you 100%. I think that more and more we're starting to understand that maybe what we consider extraterrestrials or interdimensional beings are all a part of our consciousness, and they come out at different times to assist in our path, to bring things to our attention, and they present themselves as different entities, as different beings, maybe spirit animals, but it's all essentially part of our consciousness that works with us, and it's also part of this imaginal realm. And it's not to say that these beings and intelligences aren't real, but I believe that the real aliens, the real outer space, the real interdimensional realms are accessible from within ourselves.
Oh yeah, exactly. That's totally it. Yeah, for sure. And so that's why that there's this interesting relationship between your center and then the sort of this symbolic center in the sky. That's what I've learned throughout, you know, the last handful of years is by going within, that's how you're able to travel to these other places. And it's through this inner sort of dynamic, I believe, is how these sort of entities also travel about. I've been kind of gearing up to do this. I think there's a huge northern correspondence with ETs as well. There's a lot of interesting things about the northern portion of Earth having an opening. You know, the North Pole is really fascinating to me. Both poles are interesting. I don't know what your cosmology is, but I tend to focus more on that center. And there has been so much that has been said about there being this sort of, you know, threshold there in one way or the other, right? That there's this sort of ladder either going above or going below symbolically. And so I kind of wonder if potentially, you know, if that's where some of these things are actually kind of coming from or whatnot. And there's material out there that basically suggests this. But yeah, no, I'm pretty much of the same opinion with you about that. I think that well, I mean, I'll just say this is kind of a tangent too, but I used to have night vision goggles for a number of years. And so I would go sky watching and I saw so many things, you know, in the sky over the course of like 8 years or something like that. And it really blew my mind. And it's one of these things where once you see this stuff, you actually have like more questions than answers. And then once I kind of made myself open to seeing these things, that's when I actually started having naked eye sightings as well. You know, just traveling about and seeing things that were actually even more sort of fantastic than what I was seeing in the night vision goggles. So there is activity up there. Like no matter like what you want to say about where they're coming from, where they're going. I always used to think, Tom, like, what are they like bringing with them, or like, what are they trafficking things or something like that? People have always said that Earth is kind of like a pit stop between different places, which I think is interesting too, because I'm kind of inclined to think that, at least from how I view things, I personally, I don't know if I buy any map that exists of Earth. Right. Personally, the map is not the terrain. There's lots of propaganda with maps and things like that. But it seems to me that we might live in Middle Earth, that I think there's outer lands and inner lands, and we're somewhere in between. And I don't know if we have a full sort of comprehension of what these inner lands or outer lands look like. So I think kind of symbolically being in Middle Earth makes a lot of sense. So maybe some of these things are going back and forth.
Let's get a little deeper into your understanding of our cosmology. This has been a very popular topic that's come across this show many times. I still have no idea what we're on. All I know is that what we're presented through our modern science, academia, astronomy makes no sense to me, and that it seems to be there's so many more layers to our reality than we could ever understand. There seems to be an effort throughout history to distort the information that could tell us what this realm is possibly really all about. But you mentioned that we may be in Middle Earth. Talk a little bit more about that and your understanding of our cosmology in general.
Yeah, sure. So I'm basically I've learned to embrace the mystery
Yeah.
essentially, and so I'm okay not
Right.
knowing. Um, and so just putting that out there first and foremost. But actually, there's this guy named Martin Kenny that I thought was really interesting, and his whole thing was kind of reviving this cosmic egg sort of theory. I don't know if you could even find his presentations online or whatever, but it kind of fits in line with my understanding of things as well. But basically, that Earth to me seems to be a realm first and foremost. So I think if you go to the innermost aspects of Earth, I would not be surprised if you end up like on the outside of Earth, or I wouldn't be surprised if it just turns into something that's purely etheric or metaphysical, right? Same thing with going out. So it's almost more like a field that way, right? Like a vibrational field. But sort of the thing that I hinge everything on is this center, right? This idea of this central axis, this world axis. Um, to me, I kind of look at it like almost like an antenna or a tower. So if you get further away from the tower that's emitting a signal, the signal's going to get lost or the signal's going to get distorted, right? There's going to be noise, basically. And so it makes me wonder if that's what this realm is that you're kind of fixed to be within a certain proximity of this central sort of axis or this central sort of tower. To me, I actually see this as being related to the concept potentially that we live in a ringland system and that there are rings basically further
Yeah.
out and rings further in. And what I've heard too is that these outer rings actually have a correspondence with the outer planets. And so the furthest ring out might actually relate to
Wow.
Saturn. The closest ring in, if you're talking about it from a seven planet system, which is basically usually what I how I decode things, the ring closest in actually relates more so to Mercury. And so that's to say that the furthest ring out, potentially, that we live almost in a system that's not unlike a tree, where the rings on the outer edge of the tree, right? If you're to cut a tree in half, those are the oldest rings. If you go to the center, that's the newest ring, basically. So everything kind of is expressed outwardly. It's kind of not unlike a ripple, like in water. So you throw a rock or a pebble in water, the rings emanate from the center. More polar symbolism, by the way, more center symbolism, concentric ring symbolism is baked into all of this stuff. How many times have we heard that we live within spheres or something along these lines? It plays right into that as well. So it's possible that the outer lands more so relate to things that are Saturnian, older entities, potentially colder, much wiser, more technologically advanced, things along those lines. And we know that Saturn eats its children, right? That's how Saturn kind of maintains control. Saturn is kind of paranoid about being dethroned. It doesn't want to be dethroned, right? If we are somewhere in the middle, that means that on an age level, potentially, this is all hypothetical sort of stuff, but potentially that we're not the oldest entities here, but we're also not the youngest entities either. And so the inner lands would actually be where more of the more pure etheric entities potentially might be. And there are people out there from all sorts of different, like, camps that basically still have this understanding that the North is more so related to this Eden sort of thing. There's even people who say that there is a camp of saints that literally has a relationship with Christ, literally
Wow.
at the North Pole. And that people like Christ are still like hanging out there and waiting for something to happen or whatever. But this is totally a thing. There's even a lot of myths too, where the sages that bestowed wisdom upon humanity came from the northern sky. So the Apkallu is one example. The Rishis in Vedic mythology is another example. That there's 7 sages that came from the northern sky, and oftentimes they're directly associated with Ursa Major, basically. I've said before that to me it appears that the oldest gods come from the north. And so Saturn, to me, seems to have been potentially the first planet, maybe, that was birthed, had more of a pure sort of essence to it. But then just over time, by being pushed away from that sacred center, by being pushed away from the world axis, it actually matured and got old and kind of had a fall from grace. So that is how I kind of tend to look at everything. So we might be somewhere in between lands that have newer etheric pure entities and old sort of ancient kind of entities. And so then this world is kind of a mixture between, and maybe that's where we're getting our technology from. Maybe we're getting it from older civilizations that are just beyond our threshold that we don't even really understand or know anything about. And we might just be, I don't know, so new and young and not as developed that they can take advantage of us at will. And potentially these are the things we're seeing flying around and whatnot. So I don't know. It's all just speculative.
I love it, man. Well, while we're in deep woo-woo waters, let's talk a little bit about Stargate symbolism, architecture, and portal symbolism that we see throughout history. We see the doors to nowhere, beams coming out of the sky. Could it be that we had access to these other lands somehow through our own construction abilities?
Yeah, I could see it that there are ways that we were able to access these lands through technology, but also maybe through like sacred science, basically through modern science, but then also through sacred science. So maybe also there's ways that we were able to access these lands naturally. So one of the things that's been said kind of along the lines of this cosmic egg theory is that these outer lands and inner lands, these concentric rings actually do have barriers between them. And that the different ages that we cycle through, these barriers become thin, and that there are ways to access and go to these different planes of existence. And so one thing I've heard is that, and some of this stuff is coming back to me because it's been years since I've looked into it, but as an example, this outer land, that the sun and moon would be Jupiter and Saturn, that the sun would be Jupiter, Saturn would be its moon. Here we have our own sun and moon, and then the realm closer in, the sun and moon would be Mars and Venus. Mars would be the symbolic sun, Venus would be the symbolic moon, and then this innermost land, the sun and moon, is actually played by Mercury, which Mercury has this dualistic sort of dynamic to it, that it actually plays roles as both, basically. And that there are these partitions or barriers between these different lands, and that maybe during these cyclical ages, these different yuga cycles and stuff, that the openings actually become available to us, and things may come in, things may leave, something along those lines. I'm not sure. But I think that if you look at the sort of realm in which we live as from a more metaphysical perspective, I'm not saying I can personally do it, but it seems as though travel and kind of shortcuts to places and things like that, to me, seems very doable. When you kind of just look at the etheric nature in which we live, it's like anything you really look at here that's physical, if you really, really start trying to understand it, it becomes more and more etheric and more spiritual, and there's some aspect of it you can't even really explain using like modern science and things like that, right? You realize that a lot of things that we were taught in school actually just becomes theoretical pretty much, even though they're teaching it as fact.
100%.
Right?
Now, for the last few minutes we have, I know you've been working with tarot for a long time. Tell us a little bit about your understanding of the mechanics and how it can be used as a tool to understand our personal lives, our reality, and beyond.
Right. Yeah. So it's been an amazing tool for me. It's really helped my sort of conscious development, my spiritual development. And I like to use it in a bit of a different way than maybe a lot of other people. And so I'll just say this about divination across the board. Most people, when they get into astrology or they get into tarot, they pretty much exclusively, especially if they're young, they only want to use it for forecasting and they only want to use it to predict the future, right? So most people use astrology that way. A lot of people come to me for tarot readings, and I think a lot of my audience understands kind of where I'm coming from with everything. But I do have occasionally people who just, ask me like, am I going to get this job? Am I going to, is this guy going to get with me or something along those lines? Right. And I have to let them down and tell them that I'm not that kind of reader. Right. So I think the tarot is a really great tool to reflect. So if you have just gone through an experience, if you want to kind of like recap something that you just went through, I think that the tarot is really great at doing that. I don't think it's as good as to look ahead and to kind of forecast like, the year I'm going to have, right? Because the future really isn't written yet, right? So that's one thing I'll say. But also, what I'll say is that the system itself, um, it's a book of symbols, it's a book of changes, and it's a book of questions, and it's there for your development, basically. So you don't need to use the tarot and actually shuffle the deck and pull cards and light a candle and kind of do a divination system or a divination practice or whatever. You don't need to do that with the tarot. There is so much valuable information baked into the cards that just by studying the cards, you are going to learn something about yourself, right? And I would say for people that it's a good sort of practice to like follow whatever your interest is. So if you suddenly become interested in the Hermit card, as an example, well, then what does the Hermit say about where you're at right now? What's the symbolism of the Hermit? Why is he holding that lamp? Why is he associated with caves? Why is he isolated? What does the Hermit have to do with the number nine? What does the Hermit have to do with Virgo and Mercury? How do these things sort of speak to you? Do you have any of this stuff in your chart? Maybe you are a Virgo. Maybe you're going through a period where you might want to sort of distance yourself away from the masses and kind of do that inner work and whatever. So you can use it that way, as kind of a system to understand. And that's what I do with all divination systems, basically. So I'm less so interested in my personal life doing divination with these systems. I'm more so interested in wanting to learn why they're constructed that way and what these systems are trying to say about the universe, and then therefore myself, right? My sort of inner universe. And so I've been blown away at the tarot and how many things it actually encodes. I'm still completely like in awesome times where I will notice something that I never noticed before, or I'll learn a new myth that somehow relates to the card. And so the way I think about it is that it really is, in a way, it's like a spiritual map, and you can use it in so many different ways. It's pretty much unlimited. But as you grow your conscious awareness, your understanding of whatever system you like to follow is also going to grow, right? So it's almost like watching a movie when you're a kid versus watching a movie when you're an adult. All of the new things that you see, oh my God, there's a lot of adult humor in here that I didn't pick up as a kid, or this plot is really deep, and the script is really just dynamic or whatever. And so that's what I've noticed. So that's kind of been a fun thing for me to kind of see too, is like my early interpretations of the cards and then kind of where I'm at now. But you're learning about the sacred science. Any good divination system is going to encode all of the different aspects about sort of sacred science symbolism, right? So there's going to be an elemental correspondence. There's going to be things related to probably numerology and whatnot. And every system has their own sort of strength, and every system has kind of its own kind of personality, I would say. I happen to be very attracted to the tarot because I'm a very visual person. So seeing literally, these illustrations and things like that to me is has just been very, very valuable. But knowing that there's people who have refined this system for hundreds and hundreds of years, potentially even longer than that, to me is where like the real sort of like juice is. It's like this system has been refined by countless people over time. And so even if you don't inherently understand it, it's, for me at least, it was worth continuing to pursue. And as I started to kind of get why certain cards looked the way they looked and encoded what they encoded, I became even more appreciative of the fact that I just decided to stay with it, even though I didn't quite understand it, to kind of begin
Would
with.
you say it can be just as effective if, like you said, you don't have a complete understanding of how everything works, but you are working with it in a sense that you're making it your own, understanding the outcomes that you are working with? Would you say it's just as effective as if you make something like this your own by adding your own techniques and methods to it?
I think, yes, I think you're encouraged to come up with your own techniques. I think that that's actually part of its design, personally, is that you should develop a relationship with it, and you're going to anyway, right? And so you're going to develop your own relationship with it, whether it's a good relationship or a bad relationship or it's toxic or whatever. It kind of just depends on how you decide to use it, right? And so I think you're going to do that anyway. So I always encourage people to do that. What I will say though is that I strongly prefer older classic decks, and it's because they have more symbolic value. And so the older decks that I have in my collection are easily the most symbolically potent. And a lot of newer decks lose a lot of this stuff for the sake of newness or progress or evolution or whatever you want to say. And so there's a lot of new decks that I don't really care for. There are some illustrators and creators that do have a more of a traditional sort of understanding of the system. And so they realize that it's important, as an example, to have the charioteer, surrounded by four posts, with a canopy of stars. There's little things like that may not seem like that big of a deal, that actually are there for like a very, very, very good reason. And so personally, it's the most common deck you can find. I recommend the Rider-Waite deck, and I used to prefer the Thoth deck by Crowley. And I do like that deck a lot. There's a lot of information in there that I do value, but I would say that the Rider-Waite deck, the classic Rider-Waite deck, is so like sound in a lot of its presentation and what it chooses to include, that as a beginner, that's what I would recommend for people. And I think that these newer decks, I almost would recommend those people, or people who are inclined to buy that kind of stuff. People are going to do what they're going to do regardless, right? So it's really no skin off my back. But when you understand the system, I think that it might be better off to get your head wrapped around that and then buy some of these newer decks. See what the classics have in store. See if you are interested in that stuff, and see, what there is to gain from that. And then maybe explore some of these other decks, Gummy Bear deck or Lord of the Rings deck or or whatever you want. Not to trash on those or whatever. People are gonna buy whatever they want to buy, and there's certain cool things that I can appreciate about that. But for a lot of reasons, as a student of symbolism, I have to shout out the classic decks.
Right on. Well, this has been a great discussion. I'm definitely going to have you back on. There's so much more I want to get into: origins of Abrahamic symbolism, symbolism in cinema, and much more. So, like I said, we'll definitely have to have you back. Before we close out, though, let everyone know how they can get access to all of your content.
Yeah, for sure. People can find me at symbolicstudies.com, and from there they can find my YouTube and Instagram and Twitter. I do have a Patreon. On my site, I do have tarot readings and other offerings. But long story short, if people think that I can help them with their symbolic journey, just reach out. I've got, book recommendations and all sorts of stuff like that. But yeah, I'd love to do it again. The cinema thing to me is of particular interest. Having gone to film school, I'm a film nerd sort of guy. So that's something I always enjoy, like deconstructing and whatever. I know you just had someone on talking about The Shining and things like that. Stanley Kubrick stuff, like he blows my mind. He was one of my favorite, directors for like a really long time.
Awesome.
So sounds good to me. But yeah, man, this was great. Thanks for having me on.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mario. Great information. And until next time, everyone, have a wonderful evening. We'll talk again tomorrow. See you then.